All right, guys. It was so refreshing hearing this man and seeing him in action over this past weekend at a historic PFL event. He now joins me to react to that and also talk a little bit about a big event this coming weekend, UFC 308, the one and only Dan Hardy. Welcome back to Submission Radio, man. It's been too long.
It's been too long, my friend. How are you? Are you well?
I'm great, man. I'm great. It's great to have you on the program. I want to get into it and talk about Francis Ngannou, Dan, because I was talking about it with Luke Thomas yesterday on the preview show, and not many people are talking about the fact that Francis unified the UFC, Pride, Bellator, PFL, and then what else? Another title, I think, over the past weekend. It's pretty incredible what he's able to do, and the title that he holds now.
He's a scary and talented individual, and just the performance and the finish on its own is impressive. But you take into account all of the pressure that he went in there on his shoulders and all of the emotional struggles to boot. It was even more impressive.
When people are talking about who the greatest heavyweight in MMA right now is, I think Francis is the guy, right? Like, you look at everybody else out there, it's hard to argue against that.
I mean, honestly, I play through the scenarios. I don't see any way. Who's the argument? I don't think John Jones for me would be able to withstand the power of Francis Ngannou. He's a very talented fighter, but I just don't know whether he can compete with that kind of raw power and intensity. The other conversation really for me is Tom Aspinall, who's a very, very talented fighter, very quick, very very well-rounded and very skilled. But again, it's heavyweight. If Francis connects one time, and he's got a lot of experience in elite level MMA, he's had a lot of success at elite level MMA. So, for me, Francis Ngannou right now is the man. And then, very, very closely behind, probably followed by Tom Aspinall.
Obviously, John Jones has the Stipe fight coming up, and the UFC don't cross-promote with anyone. But I feel like every time Francis fights, people keep talking about, hey, one day it would be great to see like a cross-promotional fight with John and Francis. Do you think that would ever happen, especially as demand seems to keep growing? Or do you think it's just dreams, like it could never really come together?
I'm always open to being surprised with mixed martial arts. You never know what's going to happen. There's lots of things along the way, along the journey, since the mid-90s that, if all of a sudden, oh my goodness, I didn't expect that. And, we've been told one thing and something else has happened. Sometimes you get crossovers in promotion. Sometimes you get crossovers from one sport to another. I don't know. I mean, the landscape is constantly changing. Boxing is in a state of evolution right now, in my opinion. With the new influx of money from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, it's brought a lot of players to the table and made them open to conversations that they perhaps weren't before. So I do always think that there's potential for that, especially if it's the fight that people demand to see. And I think, obviously 309, Jones versus Stipe, should be a fascinating fight for me. Ultimately the winner of that fight has to fight Tom Aspinall to really determine who's the best in the world. On the UFC roster, but I would very much make an argument for Francis Ngannou against any victor of those three fighters.
Chris Cyborg having a really cool night in the office, a lot of other great fights. What were some of your highlights?
Man, the one that stood out to me obviously was Paul Hughes. It completely blew me away. I was not expecting him to have raised his level so quickly, right? I remember watching him come through Cage Warriors, watching his amateur career, and I could always tell that he was gonna be something quite special. He was supremely talented, very well rounded, very grounded for a young man as well. Speaks well. He's very mature in his thinking and in his approach to the game. But when I saw the fight on paper the first thing I thought to myself is, my goodness, that is a leap up in competition. I mean, when he made his Bellator debut in Dublin, he was up against a tough veteran in Bobby King, and Bobby challenged him as we expected him to. But there is a leap to go from Bobby King to AJ McKee, and it would have required him to really, not only back himself and trust in his skills, but also to really level up technically and round himself out as a fighter. And I just thought he looked tremendous at every range. And it wasn't like he wasn't taking chances. It wasn't a cagey performance. He was flying knees to power punches and take down a fence. And I was just very, very surprised and impressed. It was, for me, a career-defining performance, and I think we need to all keep an eye on Paul Hughes.
Not only that, but it looks like Conor McGregor will be at the next fight, right? You guys are going to have to bump up security. It's going to be part 2.
Yeah, absolutely. It should be interesting. Anything that kind of pays attention to, it usually draws a lot of other interest as well. It's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out. I mean, again, that's another jump up in competition. AJ's excellent, but the wrestling of Nurmagomedov, and coupled with that, a much slicker striking game than we see from a lot of lightweights with that strength of wrestling. It's a fascinating fight. We'll see how it plays out.
Dude, speaking of fascinating fights, I love to get your thoughts on some of the upcoming fights. And we've got a huge one in Max Holloway and Ilia. I just got to find out from you. Who are you backing here? Who do you think is going to get it done? It's one of those ones I keep thinking about it and I keep going back and forth in my mind about how it's going to play out. It's one of those title fights where it's like one of those hard to pick them, both guys at the peak of their game, what's going to happen type fights.
I think it's a very, very interesting one. I mean, the problem for me is I don't know what Max is going to look like at this weight class. I would much rather see him at this stage move up to lightweight. I feel like he looks strong at that weight class and healthier in the weight cut. It's not like he's not cutting weight to get to that weight class as well, I'm sure. I don't know. That's the only question. I want to see what Max looks like on the scales. I definitely feel like the first couple of rounds is going to be rough for him, though. I think Topuria is going to come in trying to prove a point. I think he's going to be aggressive. He's going to be pushing Max back up against the fence and not really letting him, get the space and the reads that he wants in those first couple of rounds, because Max does tend to build into fights. The biggest concern really for Max is going to be trapped up against the fence. If those big power punches start coming around the sides, not only is he's very committed to landing that punch, but he's very accurate as well. He's good at reading people as they move on to those punches. We saw that even before his UFC career. And then, his neck attacks, even if he doesn't knock Max out, he could take him down. He could attack his neck. He could cause a lot of problems. So those first couple of rounds could be quite turbulent. And it wouldn't surprise me if we're going into the third round with Max looking a little bit worn and a little bit beaten up. But then, if he does get through that, I could see him start to turn the tide in his direction. Get settled in behind his jab and start to manage the pace a little bit and pick his pace up for the last 3 rounds. The one thing I don't know why it keeps sticking out in my mind is his fight against Cub Swanson, where he grabs that guillotine and just steps over. I feel, even if he doesn't knock Topuria out, I could see him beating him up enough, like he did against Calvin Kattar, getting into that nice steady boxing rhythm where he starts to bloody his nose and make his breathing difficult. And then at some point, maybe even a body shot. We've seen him use those against a lot of fighters. Lamas is the one that comes to mind. He's just a great fighter, Max. He's got so much experience. The only question is, what's he going to look like at this weight class, and is it time for him to be in a weight class above?
Well, he's got that BMF title, right? So regardless, he'll be going probably up there, defending that next. What do you think of Topuria wanting to go up against Islam? Obviously, we know he's a devastating striker. He's apparently got a pretty good wrestling background as well. How do you think he would match up against Islam if he moved up?
Look, I mean, the reality is, when you're as well-rounded and as skilled as Topuria, you've got to look at the rest of the fighters in the division, your division and potentially the one above, and think to yourself, I can see ways I beat this individual. He has lots of finishing capability, and there are lots of situations where Makhachev might put his head in a position where Topuria feels like it's vulnerable, or just he feels like he might be able to open the opportunities up for his power shots to get through. I just don't know where his limit is. I feel like we're still early in his career, if I'm honest. I don't like Topuria. I feel like he's probably got the next 10 fights of his career. We're really going to see a special fighter develop. And it's not to say that he's not got the capability of beating Max Holloway, and Islam Makhachev is a jump because of the size difference. But still, he's going to be competitive no matter who he fights. I like his confidence. I have to say that.
Dude, There's him, and then there's Robert Whittaker versus Khamzat Chimaev in a crazy fight, right? Rob, I actually got a chance to watch him spar Jai Opetaia here in Sydney, who just won over there. One of the best boxers right now out of Sydney. It's like, why spar this guy in boxing, man? You're out of your mind. In front of media. Imagine if something happened and he's fighting Khamzat, man. This guy is on a mission to regain the gold before he retires. But Khamzat, so many questions, Dan. Like, the guy just can't seem to stay healthy. We can't get that kind of consistency from him. And now at middleweight against Robert Whittaker, one of the most successful middleweight champions we've seen. How do you see this one playing out? There's just so many questions.
Yeah, a lot of questions. I mean, again, kind of similar to Max. What's he going to look like at this weight class? With Chimaev, it's what's he going to look like at this point with his health. My understanding is that his immune system has been compromised for an extended period of time, and training doesn't help that at all. It often, if you're a little bit run down in training camp, you'll get sick. It's something we manage constantly. So my main concern is that Chimaev's going to come back and look healthy. But at the same time, I mean, even if he's strong for 5 minutes, 7 minutes, it's going to be a horrendous time for Rob. He really is going to have to be on his guard. What I will say, though, the experience that Rob's got against really, really strong wrestlers, the likes of Yoel Romero, I feel like he's got the skills that he would need to at least be competitive for as long as he would need to maybe start to deplete Chimaev. And, he might start to get through. We might see that championship quality from Rob Whittaker start to get through later on in the fight. And I don't know whether Chimaev would have the gas to be able to drive through 10 minutes and get that on the scorecards. I think that second round might be challenging for him. I mean, you look at what Gilbert Burns was able to do when he was able to push Chimaev into that second round. You start to see some vulnerability there. And I think someone like Whittaker being slightly bigger, more of a clean striker potentially than Gilbert Burns, he could definitely make the second half of his fight, of the fight more, certainly more in his ballpark.
You want to see get the next title shot, Sean Strickland or the winner of this fight?
I don't know. I mean, probably the winner of the Whittaker Chimaev. I mean, obviously, if Chimaev wins, then there's going to be a lot of excitement around him, and it would draw a lot of attention to the middleweight title, which I think he's deserving of the middleweight title. It's odd because for whatever reason, middleweight's always been a relatively quiet division. It's only been occasional, like the Anderson Silva era, where we had someone that really really kind of brought an electricity to it. And I feel like Adesanya was certainly that for me and for a lot of fans. And I feel like Chimaev brings that energy as well. I think the winner of this one. I think if Chimaev does it, then it would be impressive enough for him to have beaten Whittaker. And I think if Whittaker beats Chimaev, then he's taken a big risk in opening himself up to Chimaev and the risk of losing to a prospect. And the credentials of Whittaker's career speak for themselves.
You think Adesanya's out of the picture now? Do you think he bounces back here? I was talking to DDP's coach. He wants to see DDP have a rematch with Israel and South Africa after this potential next fight.
I think we'll see Izzy back. Sometimes I think fighters, especially at the top level, when they're up there in that limelight for so long, it can be exhausting. It can be really draining. And Israel's a big character. A lot of people, when they meet him, they expect him to be that big character, and I would feel like he feels pressure, especially with the amount of time that he's spending out in public, doing appearances, meeting people, etc. I would imagine that there's a lot of energy expended, which can over time take its toll. I do think we'll see him back, and I also think that this recent turbulent time in his career is going to have really refocused him. He conquered one demon with Alex Pereira, and I think that overlooking, underestimating opponents could have played into this recent version of Adesanya that we've seen, and I've been there myself. I've paid for it. I underestimated Carlos Condé, and that was a stupid thing to do in hindsight, but it was difficult for me to see at the time because of how confident I felt in my own game. And if I was Israel Adesanya, I would probably feel even more confident. So, sometimes a little bit of a check, beating the demon that's been haunting you in Alex Pereira must have really boosted his confidence a lot and made him feel pretty invincible. And I think that this little bit of a grounding period that we're seeing is going to really level him up as a fighter. What Adesanya needs is a close range striking game. He can be very, very dangerous at range, but what we've seen in recent fights is people taking that space away from him. He's either at long range or defending takedowns. And I think if he really, works on his elbow and knee game, maybe like, here's a mad suggestion. It's only just come to mind, but go and train with Anderson Silva. Go and train with Anderson Silva. Learn Anderson Silva's clinch. You remember what he did with that clinch to Rich Franklin, Stephan Bonner arrested. So, you know what I mean? Like, imagine adding that to Israel Adesanya's game. It would level him up.
Dude, game changer. I'll let you go because you got to get going to a meeting. Alex Pereira, that's another fun boxing match for Francis Ngannou. Maybe that could be a cross-promotional thing as well. But for now, guys, make sure to follow Dan Hardy and, of course, Veronica Hardy, who is fighting at UFC 309. I can't wait to see her fight. We'll get her on the show as well. Have a chat about it a little closer. Take care and have a great day, man.
Always a pleasure.